Hey, Skip.
Hi, Uncle Harry. Well, I just wasted a good Sunday. My grandmother made me go to Sunday school at her church.
So, what'd you learn?
And she was talking about the early Christians and how they had to hide underground and how Paul told them about Jesus. They all believed in Jesus, but the Romans didn't like them worshiping the real God, so they fed a lot of them to the lions.
And you found that boring?
Well, it just seemed like the Romans were really stupid because the Christians knew the truth and weren't allowed to tell anyone.
Is that what she told you?
Pretty much.
Boy, she really sucked the life out of that story. It's actually a really interesting story. The Romans were not that stupid, and the Christians at the time hadn't even decided what Christianity actually was. And Paul, the guy who ended up developing many of the concepts of Christianity, was just making up most of it as he went along.
Really? This sounds like a much better story.
Let's go and I'll explain it. Back in the time of Rome, nearly everyone believed that all natural phenomena was the result of some god making it happen. Gods were responsible for rain and rainbows, lightning, the sun rising, volcanoes, everything. If a house burned down, it was because a god started the fire. If you lost a battle, it was because your god wasn't as strong as the opponent's god. About the only group that believed only one God was responsible for all these activities were the Jews, who lived primarily in Israel, but were spread out in small pockets all over the empire. Because the Jews were so small in number, they were easily oppressed and controlled by one of the bigger empires. Since things were generally pretty bad in occupied Israel, the Jews were always looking for a predicted leader who would unite all the Jews and lead them in battle to conquer their enemies. This leader, they believed, would be selected or anointed by God and thus was called Messiah or Anointed One.
And this guy was Jesus?
Most Jews didn't think so. They had varying definitions of what the Messiah was supposed to be, and Jesus didn't match any of them. But then along comes a man named Saul, who says that he had a vision that Jesus really was the Messiah. Even though Jesus was dead, he would come back to do all the Messiah stuff shortly.
So Jesus was supposed to return to lead the Jews and kill all the Romans?
Not exactly. At this point, Saul changes his name to Paul and starts creating a completely different story. Paul may have started by trying to sell his returning Messiah story to the Jews, but it was pretty clear they weren't buying it. So he started talking to non-Jews, known as Gentiles. Paul told these Gentiles that a Messiah, or in Greek, Christos, Christ, was coming back, not to rescue the Jews, but to save these Gentiles.
Wait, now I'm confused.
I'm not surprised. If the Messiah was supposed to lead Jews to great prominence in the world, what was he saving these Gentiles from? You see, Paul wasn't talking to the elite and powerful Roman citizens. He was talking to the poor people who were just as bad off as the Jews. Most of the people living in the Roman Empire were not senators or gladiators, or even the soldiers with those cool red shields. Most were very poor, or even slaves. So Paul tells them the Messiah, Christ, was returning to save them.
I'm still confused.
Paul tells these Gentiles about a problem they didn't even know existed. He tells them they are all sinners and are going to suffer because of Adam and Eve. You see, Paul believed the story of Adam and Eve. He didn't know about Neanderthals or dinosaurs or ice ages. Paul believed the world started a few thousand years ago and that Adam and Eve doomed everybody because they ate that fruit. So these poor Gentiles now have something else to worry about. But for Paul, everything starts to make sense. Believing in Christ will allow you to be saved from sin, and Christ will return shortly to rescue all these new believers. So he starts to win converts among the downtrodden. I imagine it would have been pretty easy to sell this story early on. One can just picture a group of these early followers huddled together and making fun of all the Roman leaders, knowing that soon everything would be turned upside down. But things start to turn sour on Paul, because these new believers are waiting and waiting, and nothing happens. And then things got much worse. Some of the believers started to die off. So Paul makes another round of trips, and this time he tells them that the dead believers will be raised up first and taken to heaven, and the believers that are still alive will be taken up right after the dead ones.
How did Paul know?
He pulled this idea from ancient Jewish traditions and basically said, now it applies to non-Jews. He had to tell these believers something, or they'd start to leave. But one made-up story has to lead to another. Christ wasn't supposed to return to save just the Jews. He was supposed to save the whole world. But Paul had never been outside the Roman Empire. He didn't know how big the world really was. He didn't know that there were actually more Chinese than Romans, and these Chinese wouldn't even hear that they could be saved for another 1,000 years. It's as if I bought you a new bicycle, hid it on the other side of the world, and never told you where it was, or even that I bought you a bike. You see, Paul made a bunch of assumptions based on his limited knowledge of the world, and not based on what was actually true.
I'm still confused. If nothing happened, why are these people still believing it?
For one, it's a great story. No matter how bad off you are, someone is going to come back and rescue you. Do you know the Peanuts cartoon about the Great Pumpkin?
Yeah, Linus waits in the pumpkin patch for the great pumpkin, but he never comes.
Why doesn't he come?
Because there's no such thing as the great pumpkin.
Right. But Linus doesn't care. As long as he believes it, he's happy. And the more people he can get to believe in the Great Pumpkin, the better he feels about his beliefs.
But there never was a great pumpkin.
And now you know the story of Christianity.
Wow, my Sunday school teacher left out all the important stuff. Thanks, Uncle Harry.